So for this week on Cyber School, we're going to be covering one of our newer products, our InformaCast-enabled Wi-Fi button, part number 011527. And this button is similar to our standard call button, but it works in a vastly different manner. It doesn't make calls. It just triggers events. And this one is specifically only working with InformaCast for the time being. We will have a newer version coming out soon, but for the time being, we've only got an InformaCast enabled version. So the basics of this button is, of course, in the name, it is a Wi-Fi button. It is a Wi-Fi based alert button, which is a little strange coming from a company like CyberData, where, we're really tethered by that Cat5, Cat6 cable. So branching out of that, we're a little nervous, but I think this thing's done pretty well so far. We've gotten a lot of requests about it, and it's a very popular button since it's Wi-Fi based. And it works directly with InformaCast. Both those two first lines there and those two first points really play into the name. It is a Wi-Fi enabled InformaCast button, and it works in that manner. The way that it works is when it's pressed, it'll play a message via InformaCast, and it does that by sending what's known as an SNMP, a simple network mail protocol message, to InformaCast, and that actually triggers a message. And this one is normally going to be powered by just a regular, say like a cell phone charger. A micro USB cable is actually what can plug into it, but actually it can actually be hardwired into a particular transformer. If this thing is, say, going to be mounted on a wall in a hallway and you don't really have a regular wall outlet to plug it into, you can actually use a transformer and plug it in that way. But when it's not on actual line power, either hardwired in or running off that micro USB connection, it's got about a 4-hour battery life. So that makes this thing super powerful for chances when you might lose power, but your network can still stay up. And it also makes the Wi-Fi button mobile in certain situations where you might want to be able to travel around with a particular button. Of course, network limitations will apply if you're going to try to take this button mobile. So underneath the hood, of course, the button sends the SNMP, a simple network mail protocol message, to InformaCast when that button is pressed. And this uses what's known as an M2M, a machine-to-machine interface on InformaCast to actually trigger the message. And don't really think about too much about the M2M interface. Think of that as basically just a two screw down terminals that you can short together and trigger something, but it's all virtualized. So instead of taking a little bit of wire and shorting two pins together and make it do something, or use a switch to do that, we're just doing it all virtualized. It's another step in the virtualization of different hardware is this M2M interface. And of course, since it's going to use an M2M interface, it does require one of these interfaces be preset with a message that it will play when an event is triggered for this particular machine-to-machine interface, as well as a recipient group. So you basically have to do all your homework before you can use this button. So under normal circumstances, like I mentioned, this thing is going to be powered either by an inline transformer or just a regular micro USB connection off, basically just a little wall wart cell phone charger. We've all got tons of those laying around, so you can use one of these to plug them in. But these are really awesome, and they're ideal for low-cost under-desk panic buttons, because when you're thinking about an under-desk panic button, you want to press a button and you want it to trigger an event. And you can do the exact same thing like we covered with our standard call button. If you watched last week's Cyber School, you could do the exact same thing with that. But that's honestly about twice the price as this InformaCast enabled unit. So if you're going to be using InformaCast for your emergency notification, these Wi-Fi enabled InformaCast buttons are ideal for underdesk panic buttons or any kind of help button that you would need, just because they'll work with the notification software that you're planning on using, and they're half the price of the other alternatives that we can offer. So it makes them absolutely perfect for the underdesk panic button use case that we always talk about so much. So let's talk a little bit more about this InformaCast M2M relay. So these are just virtual contact closures. Again, basically just think about two pins like you would, say, the sense input of a say, a regular SIP call button or a paging adapter, things that you can short together and it'll trigger an action. That's the exact same thing that you have with this InformaCast machine-to-machine contact closure point. It's just a virtual contact closure. And it's specifically going to know one contact closure apart from a different one based on the OID, the object identifier, and the button's IP address when that button is pressed. Because, say the button in my office is going to have a different IP address than the button in your office. So that way InformaCast knows that they're both coming out and reaching out with this unique object identifier as well as a button IP address. So that way InformaCast knows, oh, this is Paul's button. Paul's button, when pressed, needs to send a message to, these different speakers, these cell phones, and these text displays. So that way it can handle all of that. The InformaCast M2M machine-to-machine contact closure points can handle both input and output, meaning that, they can be triggered by something and they can trigger something else, but we're only going to be using the input relays of this M2M system. Since we are sending an event to InformaCast and we want InformaCast to do something, we don't want InformaCast to tell us to do something. We already do that with our speakers, so we're telling InformaCast, hey, do something, and InformaCast does it. And of course, each relay point, each of these two machine-to-machine interfaces are going to be associated with a particular message and message group. So this is, again, going to all be preset. It's not something where you can press the button and then you press it like 3 times to pick one message and then 4 times to pick a different message. You press it once and it's always going to send that same message to that same message group unless you change it on the InformaCast system. It's always going to send the same message to the same group no matter where that button is and when you press it. As long as it's that button, it's always playing that same message to the same group. So let's talk a little bit more about the setup process now that we kind of understand what this thing does underneath the hood. So to set this thing up, of course, you're going to have to connect it to your host PC to actually get it on the network because, this thing isn't smart enough to just automatically detect and get on the right network that you want it on. You have to do that setup process. So you use a regular USB to micro USB cable included with the unit, and you just plug it into your PC and use our setup utility to detect all the available access points that it can get on and put it on one. And when you're going through that process, you'll want to set up basically the usual network information stuff. So IP address, gateway, DNS servers, all that, usual stuff you do when you're setting everything up. But we do recommend when you're setting up any of these buttons, and frankly, most CyberData products in general, is to use a static IP address. And this is important because, like we covered in our last slide, the InformaCast server differentiates one button press from another button press by that IP address. And if it's set to DHCP and the button, then the IP address for my button gets switched to your button is going to start sending my message, and we don't want it to do that. We want your button to send your message, not my message. So you want to set it up with a static IP address to prevent that. And that can be through just a regular static IP address where only the device knows its IP address and it tells the server, hey, this is my address. Or you can tell the DHCP server and set up a reservation that, hey, when this MAC address will request an IP address, give it this IP address. That's the better way to go about it, but you just want to set it up statically. Then you have to create the machine-to-machine interface on InformaCast, which is extremely simple, and we have some documentation that goes through that process, where you just set it up with the object identifier that we use at CyberData, the button's IP address, the message that you want it to send, and the message group that you want that message to go to. Super duper simple setup. It's a one-time setup per button. Really easy to go through. If you've done anything on InformaCast, it's an absolute breeze to go through and set all this stuff up. And then finally, the button is configured and ready to use. And then you just have to pick a place to install the button and install it. So let's talk a little bit more about the actual installation process. Like most products, we include some drywall screws and some drywall anchors, and you can just cut a nice little hole in your drywall and route that transformer cable through there and be able to plug it in. But you could also use that back panel and feed through a micro USB connection and basically just and actually wire in the button there. So it's really easy in terms of how you go and connect it. And once you get that back plate mounted to wherever you want want it to be mounted to, the actual button itself, the button enclosure, secures to the back plate with a single screw. So it's really, really easy to actually go and mount it in place. But when you're going through the installation process, one other thing that we recommend is you set this thing up with a mesh network. And a mesh network is basically just different access points that all use the same SSID, or basically just the Wi-Fi name. Like you're at home and you've got your Wi-Fi name set to whatever you want it to, because some people come up with quirky Wi-Fi names, or they just call it the default AT&T name that they get from their service provider. Well, you want that to be the same as you're walking through a building, where you don't want to be in, say, the factory area and it's got a different one. So say, for example, at CyberData, say we had the Wi-Fi network for the factory, Wi-Fi for the engineering area, and then Wi-Fi for sales. You couldn't move around with your button there. The Wi-Fi button that is set up for a sales area could only work in the sales area, and the Wi-Fi button set up for the engineering area could only work in the engineering area if you've got these unique access points and networks for that specific area. But if you have a mesh network where it is just this CyberData network, whether you're in the production floor, engineering, or in the sales area, as long as it's a big mesh network, it doesn't matter where you are, that button will work on that network, which just makes it a lot easier for installation, so that way it can find the best access point and sync up with that access point. But in the event of an emergency or a power failure and you want to travel around with that button, you can take the button off the wall by removing that one simple screw, and you can take the button with you with that 4-hour battery life and still be able to trigger emergency messages because you're on that mesh network. So as we move forward, now that we kind of understand what this button does, how to set it up, how to install it, let's talk about actually using one of these things. And this is one of the diagrams that we've got for one of our cut sheets. And let's just imagine that we've got a Wi-Fi alert button in a classroom. And say, for example, this is a classroom where maybe the teacher of this classroom has epilepsy. The students are all aware of this. Say it's a middle school or a high school classroom. You, of course, might not want a teacher that does that, and say kindergarten. That'd be pretty traumatic for a kindergartner to go through. But say, you've got some high school seniors, say it's like an AP government class, and they've got, a teacher that's, epileptic, and say, unfortunately that teacher has a seizure in class. And one of the students could just run up and press this help button. And that button, since it's all preset, InformaCast knows, hey, this is the button in classroom 202. And we know that if this button is pressed, the teacher has had an epileptic seizure. It can go and tell InformaCast to play a particular message, probably a discrete one, up to the front office and maybe to, emergency or maybe the police officer that's on duty at the campus police officer. He gets a text message on his phone. Hey, go to classroom 202. We've got, a health emergency there. And it can trigger that local information. It might, lock down the other classrooms near the area because there could be some commotion in that area. It could play, information from the actual speakers and horns. It could play a message in the front office. Hey, emergency in classroom 202. This is a health emergency. They know that it's a non-student related emergency. It could relay that kind of information. And since it's InformaCast, it can send an SMS message out. So it might send an SMS message out to, maybe the parents of the students in that classroom, or, maybe to family members of that particular teacher. So you get a lot of cool capability with this Wi-Fi button, just all enabled through the power of InformaCast. It really enhances the capability of this emergency notification system, but it can be used in any kind of a use case like this. It could be an underdesk panic button, and you've got a fight in a classroom, and it can trigger a lockdown message to say, hey, all the students stay in your classroom because there's a fight going on. It can dispatch, the campus security to that particular location, send out a text message. Probably not for a fight, maybe more for, a proper emergency. But, you get a lot of cool capabilities when you're using InformaCast for that emergency notification. So finally, are Wi-Fi buttons actually going to be useful for me, and are they right for my environment? Are you using InformaCast? Because if you're not, probably not. If you're not using the main emergency notification software suite that these things work with, they probably won't be right for you because you're not using the product that they work with. So that's kind of the big thing. If you're using InformaCast, yeah, they're absolutely right for you. But if you're not, you probably don't want one of these buttons. Then we move on to your actual network setup. If you've got individual, say, networks per classroom, which would be kind of a weird setup, and boy, I wouldn't want to be the IT administrator administrating that. That'd be a pain in the butt. But if it's a big old mesh network and every access point has the same SSID, it makes it really easy to implement these buttons and allows the buttons to be mobile, so that way you can utilize that 4-hour battery life that we have. And these things are really good for panic buttons. I think that's gonna be the main use case that we see for a lot of these. Is they're ideal for underdesk panic buttons because it's just a little bit easier and less consequential for somebody to see a wall wart for a cell phone charger and that cable going underneath the desk. People would just think, oh, it's just for their iPhone. They're just plugging in their iPhone, or maybe they've got, a keyboard tray and they've got, a little wireless charging pad on there for their Samsung phone. So people might not think that much about a cell phone cable, actually going down underneath and plugging into something, but they might think something about a Cat 5 or a Cat 6 cable going underneath the desk, where they've got one that's the same color going up to the desk going up to the phone on their desk. They might think a little bit more about that than they would a regular cell phone cable. So I think these things will be really good for panic buttons, and I think that's where we're going to end up selling a lot of these. But another great reason, and another reason that these are great for any InformaCast users, is these are just really one of the most economical options for an alert button out there. I know for at least products that we make, this is the most economical option that we have. It might be the most economical option for InformaCast alert buttons, period. I can't say that. I haven't, researched all of our competitors and seen if they've got any, very economically priced buttons, but they're at a very great price point if you need to get multiples of these things for underdesk panic buttons. So in a sense, I do think these buttons are going to be right for just about any user in the InformaCast environment. And just some final terms that we went through and we used. SNMP I threw around quite a bit because that's the protocol that our devices use to actually communicate with InformaCast, and that is Simple Network Mail Protocol. Then we've got M2M, the main interface that we're using to communicate with InformaCast, where those SNMP, those Simple Network Mail Protocol messages are going, and that is a machine-to-machine interface. Again, those virtualized contact closure points. OID is another term that I use, and that's just an object identifier. Just helps further identify the model of that particular button that went through. And then finally, mesh network is just a term that's used for a Wi-Fi network, where a single Wi-Fi network can be expanded across multiple access points.
Thank you for watching this edition of Cyber School. If you have any questions, please get in contact with our sales department. They are available by email at sales@cyberdata.net or by phone at 831-373-2601 extension 334. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content like this from CyberData.